Welcome back to the podcast, everybody. I am here with another incredible guest. I'm here with David Huff. Welcome.
Well, thank you. I love to be called incredible. It's a great way to start the day. So
Well,
thanks, man.
I do what I do what I can.
I'll come
So,
on more often if that's the way you greet me. So thank you.
okay, great. So, David is someone who I had the pleasure of meeting through the TEDx journey, and I've gotten to know you after that. Now that we have, mental and emotional bandwidth to
Mhm.
do things beyond that. And one of the things I've learned is you just are very multifaceted and multi-talented. So I'm going to lay the foundation of what I know you kind of do.
Mhm.
I'm gonna let you fill in the gaps and just let the listeners know who the human is that's arriving today. So, what I know is that you are a leadership strategist, a phenomenal storyteller. We'll circle back to that, a photographer, a speaker, and a writer, and that you have a really incredible way of dancing between those things and weaving those things into meaning making and supporting people in contributing to this
Mhm.
changing world.
Mhm.
So that is my foundational knowing of you. What did I miss or what would you like to add?
No, I think it's pretty good. I'm the oldest son of my mom and dad. I have two younger brothers, and I've lived in and out of Western North Carolina for since 1980. So these mountains of North Carolina keep calling me back. And it's all, to me, it's all about story and narrative, which is why I love talking with you today, because that's what you're about too. So I look forward to this.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, one of the things that I want to name for the listeners is you have an amazing TEDx talk called We Are Trail Magic.
Mm,
And for people in my orbit, they've heard me talk about magic for years. I talk about
mm,
practical magic and radical magic and this idea that when we bring our humanity and contribute and collaborate, there's really incredible outcomes
mm,
that can unfold. And I listened to your talk in practice many times and often was moved to tears
mm.
and I just felt it through your story. So I'm wondering if you can share with people that sort of inner motivation for crafting that talk because it's not an easy thing to do and we did
No,
it.
yeah, we did it. Congratulations to you. We went through the trial of fire. It was for both of us, it was like a long trail journey, right? And we hit rain, we hit sunny days. There were times when we thought the mountain's too high to climb. How are we going to make it?
Mhm.
But we made it not by ourselves. That's the point. We made it with other people and one another, our coaches, our other TEDx speakers, the folks providing support, and the audience, right? The day of, which I thought was really powerful. And that's the metaphor with trail magic, right? So it comes from a long hiking trail like the Appalachian Trail. That's sort of where it started. It's practiced on other long trails, Pacific Coast Trail, also over in Japan on the Shinitsu Trail. They have what they call trail magic. And it starts with offering food if somebody's hungry. You're sharing food out of your pack or water if someone needs food. If someone needs a ride into town and you're by, you can take them into town for supplies. People even do it intentionally now where they'll set up stations along the long trail with food and water and things like that to provide support. And so that the tangible is important, right? Because if you're thirsty or you're hungry or you need a ride into town, the tangible is important. But more than that, it's the being seen and being recognized and being supported by another human being who steps in not because he or she has to, but because there's this understanding we have that we're in this together, whatever this is, and that we do a lot in our life, perhaps by ourselves, and we do, and we can definitely get from here to there in many cases by ourselves. I mean, we're independent, but this journey requires other folks helping us, and it's more fun, right? When we're sharing and giving and take. So a culture then is built around that giving and that taking and that participation, as I call it. And when we step in and offer what we have, we're offering some of ourself. But also when we receive, we're also part of that relationship and that dynamic. So it's both the giving and the receiving. And that's how community or culture is formed, and it's how it's tended. And if we step back and don't participate, well, it falls apart. It's not as structured, it's not as healthy, and it's not as fun. And at the large scale, our larger communities require us to participate. And if we don't, if we step back, then the things we want to have happen or be done, they don't get done.
Yeah. One of the things I really appreciate about the way you talk about this is I think when we hear participation, a lot of people think immediately contribution. What is it? What is mine to give? What is mine to do? And that matters, right? That matters so much, even if it's a small thing, even if it's something that we don't think is enough, it's a
Mhm,
contribution.
mhm, mhm,
And something that I've had my own ongoing journey with, and I really resonated with in your talk is participation is receivership,
mhm,
generous, humble receivership. And
mhm.
I'm curious if you can just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah,
The process of becoming a generous receiver.
absolutely. Well, first of all, what you just said about the size of whatever it is we give, the size, like you said, doesn't matter, right? Every act of giving or kindness or what we call trail magic is important. Some people do amazing big things in their life that we might call trail magic, but it's also the day in and day out. It's the
Yeah.
small things. They all add up and they're all part of that. So the receiving side, a lot of us, like myself, maybe it's because I'm the oldest or what have you, but we pride individuality and independence in our culture, right? And that
Yeah,
and
same,
those are
same.
important. Well, yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's one of the things perhaps that our culture offers to the rest of the world. That's a positive thing. That the individual does matter. That his or her way of seeing the world or living in the world has value. And as an individual person, that's important to me, right? At the same time, we also, because we're not in this together and because the journey down the trail is a lot more fun if we participate, being open to receiving is equally important because what it does, first of all, there is a humility there and a realization and perhaps a maturity that I realize, well, I really can't do it all by myself, right? When I went to graduate school, and got my master's degree, my big takeaway was that I know a lot less about things than I thought I did, right? So, that's part of the process of getting older or being more mature. The same thing about living in the world where we realize that we require the help and the assistance of others, but it's not easy. So by coming to a place where we're able to accept that, not only is it helpful for us, but it also says to the other person, I see you. I recognize what you're offering. I recognize the gift that you're giving. And that's part of the giving back in that way. And that's part of how we're wired as human beings to have that interrelationship and that interconnection. I mean, we do all sorts of wild, crazy things as human beings that are not helpful. But this is the helpful part that I think is in our DNA, is this desire to both give and receive. And that's what knits together relationship. It's what keeps a relationship intact. I mean, we know we've been in relationships where when the balance is off, maybe I'm giving too much or not receiving. That doesn't work. Or if I'm giving the wrong thing, it's not what the receiver needs.
Yeah.
Or if I'm receiving and I'm not appreciating what's being given, right? So that's part of that human dynamic. When it works, it's magic.
Yeah. And you saying that I think also brings up the messy trial and error of it
Mm,
all. Is I think in conscious conversations and lives, there's often this idea of getting it right that goes beneath the surface. And I think
mm,
sometimes we learn about the people that matter most by giving the wrong thing or at the wrong time or whatever it is. And then we recalibrate, we learn, we grow, and it's the showing up in spite of the alchemy of all of that that
mm.
I have seen lead to magic in my own experiences. I'm curious if you have thoughts on the messiness of this.
Well, yeah, it is messy. I mean, we have a story in my family we like to tell that my mom told us. Her mother-in-law, our grandmother, who grew up on the mountains of eastern Kentucky and had a huge farm in southern Indiana, a huge garden where she grew all of her vegetables. When mom came into the family, she thought, okay, my mother-in-law is a gardener, so I'm going to bring her flowers when I come visit. Well, my grandmother, in her Appalachian Kentucky vernacular, her response to my mother was, "Are they ever blooming?" Well, what my grandmother meant by that is, are they fake? Because she wasn't interested in fresh cut flowers that would die in her house. She liked plastic fake flowers that could be pretty or ever blooming all year round. Well, my mother was practicing the golden rule. She was doing unto someone else the way she wanted done unto herself. But what we realize is that that's not asking what does the other person want or need. And at first, my mother got her feelings hurt because she felt rejected. And then she said, wait a minute, what does my mother-in-law want? She wants plastic flowers, which my mother felt were tacky. But if that's what her mother-in-law wanted, that's what she would do. So she then brought ever blooming plastic flowers next. And remember, this is back in the day before fake flowers looked real. They really looked bad. They were plastic and garish. So that's what we might call the platinum rule, right? Where we ask, what does the other person want or need from me?
Yeah.
And then am I able to offer that? Now, if I'm not, let's be honest, right? Maybe they're wanting or needing something from me that's not mine to give. I don't feel comfortable giving it. I don't have the capacity. Well, that's good to know. We might be able to negotiate that. We might not. And that's where we might have to go our separate ways. But my mother realized, although she did not like these flowers, they weren't for her, they were for her mother-in-law.
Yeah.
And so that's how she communicated, I love you. Thank you for having me here. I'm going to give you what you want.
Yeah. An actual gift versus more of a gift that makes you feel good about yourself to give because it reflects on you.
Well,
Sounds
you
like
have
you really
both, don't you? Right? I mean, absolutely. So it's fun to give, right? And so
listen.
this actually worked out well for mom because then she got the positive response that she wanted, because we want that, by giving the appropriate thing that my grandmother really wanted. And, talk about different cultures and,
Yeah.
mother-in-law, daughter-in-law dynamic, it's all part of that. But able to work that out and do a lot of listening and getting out of the feeling of being hurt or rejected, which is hard, and
Yeah.
say, okay, what is my goal here? My goal is to have a relationship with my mother-in-law, and she wanted to have a relationship with her mother-in-law because she loved my father, and that was important. But also, she had three sons, and she wanted them to have a relationship with their grandmother, which we did. We have a wonderful relationship with our grandmother, in part due to my mother.
Yeah. I want to circle back to storytelling because
Mm,
this is something we were talking about this just recently when we were gathering with our fellow speakers. You have a natural knack for storytelling in a way that
mm,
just creates metaphor of meaning. Like, I mean, metaphor is rooted in meaning, but you have a natural way of that.
mm,
And I'm curious what you see as storytelling's role
mm,
in this changing, evolving, in many ways crumbling, restructuring world right now.
mm, mm. That's a great question. Well, first of all, we're all stories. We're living narratives all the time. I heard someone years ago say, we all have probably our own movie soundtrack in our head as we go through life. And if we're listening to music in the car or whatever, it's often our theme song or background music to our own movie. And our stories are important because we're experiencing and creating and evoking a life in a way that's not evoked by anybody else,
Yeah.
right? So each of our stories, regardless of who we are, even the people we may not like, their story is unique and special because of the story, right? The narrative or the experience. Well, we seem to have been telling stories before we knew how to write. I mean, think about early human beings who developed a way to communicate and talk would be telling stories about where they had been or where they were going, or where to find the big woolly mammoth to hunt or whatever, right? In
Mhm.
those early human beings. And writing didn't come along till much later. So we've developed this ability, once we had language, to tell stories, probably also to entertain ourselves. We have a sense of humor. So once you have language, you're probably going to tell stories, and I'm sure jokes came across very early. I'm sure humans found things about themselves early on that were just funny, right? That we still feel funny today. And then telling stories on one another. Gossip probably started early on, right? Because we tend to be a social species. We're interested in what one another is doing. We're interested in the narrative of the room, the narrative of the culture. anyone that's traveled overseas or into a foreign culture, if they have any awareness at all, they can feel a little awkward at first because they're not really sure what's the cultural narrative here, right? So I want to understand what's some of the story, what's some of the norms about how these people go through their lives so that I can kind of fit in a little bit, at least not be so rude or outstanding, and also connect and relate and enjoy the experience better. But we tend to remember the story over anything else,
Mhm.
not the facts, not the long philosophical discourse about this, that, or the other, but the story. And, I was fortunate because my father was a storyteller. He actually created these stories that he called the Dewberry Creek stories. And he would tell us these stories as kids about a mythical place in the mountains of Kentucky called Dewberry Creek.
Oh.
And he came up with one long one called Christmas Candy that was based on something that happened when he was younger around a train that was coming to the mountains every Christmas and it would bring candy to the poor kids living in Kentucky. And one year, the great snow fell and the train couldn't make it through. So this one man who was kind of an outlier in the community, everybody thought he was kind of a little strange. He went down, traipsed down the mountain in the snow, got the candy box and brought it back to the kids, right,
Mm.
for them to be able to have the Christmas. So these types of narratives and stories, we remember them. They also say a little bit about humanity, say a little bit about who we are. My brother Steve then started to create his own stories that he shared with his kids growing up, invented his own stories. And of course, we're living in an era now of multimedia, of where we are just bombarded by narrative and story all the time. And a good story, like a good lie, doesn't have to be quote unquote true in its full sense to resonate. But of course, if we're having to make decisions or plan or organize or use that sort of left side of our brain that requires correct information, we are living in an era where sort of the wackiness of narrative or storytelling or outright lies, lies, lies sort of becomes the norm. The trick then, and I think the ancient Greeks were not so concerned about quote unquote being ethical and telling the truth. They were more concerned with being smart enough or aware enough to realize or to decide whether or not the story was true or not. So they would probably have more difficulty with the person taken in by the lie than the person telling the lie. So I
Mm.
think there's something on us to be aware. And anyone, like yourself, when we do advanced education, we're taught to double check, to cross-reference. You're an author, you've put together all this research, and so you want to make sure that, hey, here's the story about why this is important, but it's also backed up on stuff that I can stand on and validate. But it's also the story makers who create reality, who create the reality that we're in. Um, Even if it's, if we have different myths in our families and our lives. My family is a big Star Wars myth family, right? So we use that Star Wars language to talk all the time. And my youngest brother reminded me the other day, he said, David, we're no longer Luke Skywalker. We're not the young hero or the Princess Leia. We're Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? We're the old guys right now that are supposed to help the young ones find their way. But once you have a story and you realize, like, okay, that helps me understand I'm no longer the young hero. I'm the old wizard living in the wilderness who might help the hero find his or her way.
Mhm. Yeah, there was so much in there. And what I feel every time I hear you speak to story, or even just hearing about how your family has created their own stories, is just this sense of emotional resonance.
Mm,
Story isn't about the plot alone. It's
mm,
it's
mm,
about conjuring a felt sense
mm,
in the
mm,
listener, in the teller. And
mm,
you know, my background is very rooted in that right hemispheric wisdom. And I know people change and are
mm,
motivated when they feel something,
mm,
when something becomes alive in them. And
mm,
so I'm just feeling called to sort of name and celebrate that magic in story weaving and storytelling and passing on and being mindful of the stories that we're amplifying and writing and living is
mm,
part of it
mm.
too.
Well, that's also where we're living sort of in also a great era where different people are able to tell and share their stories.
Yeah.
That's, everything has a double edge to it. And one might look at the internet, we're using it right now to communicate as having pros and cons. One of the things that's allowed is for folks to share stories. But like the ancient Greeks said, we have to decide for ourselves whether that story resonates or whether it has truth. And that's part of, being an aware person. But the stories themselves, I mean, absolutely. We're hungry for stories. I think we feed on story. We seek out story
Yeah.
either by passively consuming story or engaging with other human beings and creating story. You and I are creating a story right now. We'll remember this experience, the conversation, the dialogue, the being with one another. And this is part of my story journey being with you this morning. And that's rich for me.
Mhm.
And but because we communicate in this way and we're hungry for this, this is why or where those who are able to craft and tell story, right, have in some sense an advantage because it's a communication tool. It can be used for good, it can be used for ill
Yeah.
because we're wired to crave story, to digest story, and to act on story.
Yeah. Okay, I want to dive in deeper.
Yep.
So, one of the things we've talked about before in our other conversations is archetypes and sort of the I wish there was a better term, but the light and the shadow aspects of our
Mm-hmm.
humanity
Mm-hmm.
and the stories we live and the stories we tell. And I'm curious if you can just speak to I don't even know if it's what you know or where you're leaning and exploring as this world is showing so much challenge
Mm,
and and hurt
mm,
because a lot of the people listening may be overwhelmed by that
mm,
and speaking
mm.
archetypally through this holistic lens of human experience evolution storytelling. What I know you have stuff. What's wanting to come up and out about that? Because we also have a cultural narrative that things are supposed to be fast, friendly, and fun.
Yeah,
And if it's not, there's something wrong.
that's right.
So there's
Well, yeah, sorry. Yeah, no, it's a great. I love this because this is to me part of really a rich part of what I talk about and what I've learned and continue to learn about. So as a photographer, both what's important in photography is both light and shadow. You have to have contrast. If you don't have contrast, you don't have an image. So that's important, right? So both the light and the darkness are important. Without it, we don't have contrast, we don't have story, we can't see anything. If it's all dark, there's nothing. If it's all light, there's nothing. So you're right. Our culture tends to emphasize and reward what one might call a perfectionist or holistic or resurrection or hero myth, where everything turns out hunky-dory for everybody.
yeah,
Well, any of us that have lived a life at any level know either innately because we're just aware of it or we've experienced it in hard, harsh ways that there's darkness in life. There's sorrow, there's downward, there's death, there's destruction, there's decay. That's also a part of life. And what we don't do too well in our culture writ large. I mean, people are working on it and do very well at it. But as a culture, we tend to be this light culture, this resurrected culture. Everything works out well. The hero or the heroine saves the day, and all is fine. Sunny days, blue skies, ice cream. It's all beautiful, right? Well, it's also boring. Right? So think about a really good story or a narrative. If it's just people having a good day, who cares? We know in our sense of self that it's not an interesting story. For one, it's not real. We can't relate to it. But think of a story where there's conflict, where there's dark forces. And think of a really good story, either a good movie or a good book, where we even empathize or find ways of connecting with and understanding that dark force character, whoever he or she may be. Because a good writer realizes that that dark side is also part of human nature And we can come into the narrative through that character because we see part of it within ourselves. That's rich storytelling. It's also honest storytelling because that's who we are as people. One of the things that is important about shadow and light, and this is important as a photographer, it's important as a storyteller, is that we realize that they're both two sides to the same piece. Light cannot exist unless there's shadow, and shadow can't exist unless there's light. So they have a relationship, but like every relationship, they reflect one another, but they also rub up against one another. Probably folks that are most happy, whatever that means in their own life, have found some way of living in that dance between those two, where they're not afraid of their shadow and they're also not exalting their light. They see it in a balance and in a dance. And then when they're relating to other people, they're appreciating the light in the other person, but they're not also casting out the dark in the other person, right? That's hard for me. I'm drawn to lighter people, and then I can be very judgmental when people are behaving in a darker way, right? That's my learning curve. Maybe one day I'll figure it out. But we can project that dark side of ourself onto someone else, and where we see in them what frustrates us, we're often it's something about ourselves that we haven't really embraced or come to terms with. That's hard because it's a
Yeah.
lot easier to put blame out there, shame out there, write someone off, and then think of the person in the world or worlds that you might think is just the most awful person. The work of the of depth psychology, which is my tradition, is to ask, okay, David, yes, their behavior may be awful, and we want to tag that, but why are you putting so much energy into them? What is it in them that maybe is either in you or not in you? Maybe you admire aspects of that person that you haven't fully embraced in yourself or you feel like hasn't been developed in yourself. So it's a way of reflecting back. Now, here's what's exciting about that. Not only am I able to do work within myself, but that's where bridging the darkness and the light can take place, where a sense of resolution can take place. It's not a light taking over the darkness or the darkness taking over the light, but it's where they become dance partners with one another. And then I can have that dance within myself that's quote unquote more integrated, right, than it was otherwise.
Yeah. Gosh, there's so much I could talk about with that because as somebody who really believes deeply in embodying the world we want to see, I think there's
Mhm.
what I observe a lot right now with the instability and the care and concern is
Mhm.
there's a lot of finger pointing, there's a lot
Mhm.
of blame and like you said, there are things that are undisputably harmful happening.
Mhm.
Right? Like
Mhm.
that's facts.
Mhm.
And the the magic that I have seen when we're able to, just like you said, find the part of us that's almost like vibrating like that thing that we're reacting to. And instead of suppressing, my favorite thing is to suppress. I'm not as much the judge out, I'm judge in. I will
Mhm.
shame and blame myself for my
Mhm.
shadow pieces and
Mhm.
parts, and it
Mhm.
keeps me stuck. But when I
Mhm.
can bring that part up and go, oh dear heart, you want to be a selfish asshole too. You
Mhm.
really do,
Mhm.
or some, and just
Mhm.
almost like I'm stroking her little head, going, I
Mhm.
see you too. Then
Mhm.
it takes the charge out. There's this really powerful neutralizer. And then out in the world, I can be more objective about
Mhm.
seeing what I don't consent to, what I don't agree with, but I'm not, like you said, giving it so much of my life force that I
Mhm.
can't give my life force to what actually matters, which is
Mhm.
my contribution, my
Mhm.
participation.
That's wise. That's a great insight, Megan. And you mentioned archetypes earlier because we in family systems theory they might call these parts.
Yeah.
So we have in depth psychology or archetypal psychology, we have different aspects of quote unquote our psyche. So there might be hero Dave, there might be wizard Dave. What I know about my brain is sometimes there's happy Dave, sometimes there's frustrated Dave. Sometimes that has to do with whether or not I had enough sleep the night before or whether or not I had a good meal. the brain chemistry is a lot about who we are and how we interface with the world. I realized a number of years ago that I was driving to a meeting in a town far from here, and I was driving about 25 minutes, and there was often traffic to get there. And I drove through all this traffic, and I was frustrated by the traffic. I was angry. I was late for the meeting. And when I showed up for the meeting, I got out of my car, I went right into the meeting, and I brought all of that traffic frustration into the meeting. And I was irritable and I embarrassed myself in the meeting because everybody said, "Who the hell is this?" And I realized, whoa. So I put a post-it note on my dashboard to remind myself, A, to chill in traffic. I'm still working on that, but I'm better at it. But B, when I show up at the meeting, when I had to drive a long way, to shift out of that narrative, self, being in traffic, to breathe, to compose, to reset, so that I would intentionally enter into the new space as engaged David, calm David, participant David, rather than angry, frustrated, driving through the traffic David. I'm the same person, but two different aspects of me at that time. So perhaps some of the wisdom of growing older and having other people share things with us and reflect back to us who we are is important. It was helpful for me to hear from you this morning that I'm a good storyteller. That helps me affirm that storytelling is something I do well. It's also important for me to have close friends, and as you and I become closer, who will be able to pull me aside and say, did you mean to be an asshole right now? Because it kind of came across that way. And, so we need that as well, right? Because I haven't figured it out.
Yeah.
Probably going to be tracking until I die. Still haven't figured most of it out. So I need people. And that goes back to trail magic and being on the trail.
Yeah.
Part of the trail magic culture and being on the trail is not only offering things that people need, like water, food, etc., but it's also giving some subtle feedback to people along the way that, hey, this is how we operate in a campsite when it's wet and when we're hungry and when we're sharing space. We can do that either by showing that this is how we do, or if there's an outlier, we might say, "Hey, dude, this is how we're choosing to be here in this campsite. Do you want to be with us this way? If so, great. Maybe you need to do a recheck, or maybe you need to find somewhere else to be." See, that's also part of the quote unquote magic of being together on a trail or in life.
Yeah. I mean, it just keeps coming back to we don't get to do it in the magical way alone,
That's
ever.
right.
We
That's
just
right.
don't. That myth, that story that has been sold so hard,
Mhm.
it just doesn't lead us to the destination that we are dreaming up with such intensity. It won't take us there. We have to be
Well,
in that relational field.
well, think of all the, like the Marvel super movies of all the superheroes. They crave beyond anything else, they crave one another to be in community, right? To be the Avengers as a group, not to be out there by themselves. And the ones that are out there by themselves are often very lonely and operate often out of a lot of pain or fear or what have you, and trying to find their way back in. Because, if you look at the Marvel universe, all those people are weird. If you have a superpower, you're weird, right? You're different. You're an outlier, even if it's a great superpower. And what we all crave at some level is a sense of belonging or connection. Not all at the same time, not all in the same way, but that seems to be part of our human DNA. And one might also say it's one of our superpowers, the fact that we as a species, for the most part, are able to figure out how to get along with one another. I mean, you and I can sit in a restaurant with complete strangers and not get freaked out. That's kind of unique to us as a species. And that's probably one of the reasons that we've taken over the planet, right? Because we're able to practice this reciprocal trail magic with one another. It's just who we are.
Yeah. Yeah, and the idea that our weird is not only welcome but
Hmm.
valuable. I think
Yes.
it's something that I know I stand for and I see as a solution to the
Hmm.
problems we face is rather than trying to homogenize, withdraw, fit in, conform, to co-create a world where everybody's unique weird. Again, we don't
Hmm.
have to all hold hands and be besties, but it's welcome as a
Hmm.
contribution to the current moment. And that's a skill set, right? Holding difference, holding curiosity rather than judgment. There's so many actual skills that are required for us to be able to fully move in that direction, I think,
Mhm.
with our the narrative we've been living in so much.
Well, yeah, I think, I agree 100%. And I go back to the trail magic and trail culture. People smell when they're on the trail. You're irritable. You have moments of excitement and ecstasy when you hit a peak and the sun is shining, but you're also trudging through mud at times and darkness and mosquitoes and what have you. And you run across one another at different stages of the day, different stages of life. And so being able to be open and supportive, and that's where, I think asking forgiveness is important, and then granting forgiveness is important. I think we've kind of lost a little bit in that culture, in our culture, when we kind of do away with that kind of belief that people need to be forgiven. We're all like, oh, everybody's fine, everybody's perfect, everybody's healthy, everybody's fine who they are, don't need to forgive anybody. Well, I agree that we're all fine how we are in principle, but I make mistakes all the time. And I'm gonna hope that someone's gonna forgive me. First of all, share with me when I've stepped on their foot, because I may not know it. Because I have a lot of blind sides about my own self. I don't see myself. None of us sees ourselves fully,
Yeah.
right? Even if we got a drone flying over us, we don't see ourselves fully. So having a relationship with people and being honest and open that we feel free to give feedback in a way that's constructive and helpful. That's not easy. Most of us hate it. We hate giving it. We hate receiving it. But that's part of the reciprocation and part of forming community and being with one another. I mean, we're creating story together. I have my individual story. You have your story, but it's all interwoven. And that's just part of the storytelling and the story of living. And like any good story, there's conflict. If there's no conflict, there's no story. So every good story we read has conflict. And if it's a really good story, it has a lot of conflict. And we see where it's going and we can relate to it. And we also relate to the resolution of that conflict. But we also know that stories are moments in time, like a photograph. If I'm photographing a sunrise on a mountainside after it's rained, that's a moment in time. That view is going to look very different the next day, the next week, the next year. So our stories are moments in time. It's not the full piece or the full narrative. It's part of an ongoing, you know, human drama. That's why I love the Greek stories. That's why I love the ancient Babylonian stories, why I love Shakespeare. These are stories about what it means to be human that have been told and written by fellow humans to reflect back to us aspects of ourselves. And then this is where it's wonderful to have venues and ways of people to be able to tell their stories. This is why social media has blown up because everyone's wanting to tell their story. Here's me, here's my story. This is what I'm doing. This is where I went on vacation. Here are my cats, whatever. Right? We
My
want to
dinner.
share. That's right. Because what we're wanting is for it to be seen,
Yes.
right? Now, like with anything, it can be monetized and corporatized to become this performative thing. And I think one of the things that sort of everything has the dark and the shadow. So sort of the shadow of that is that you then have performative culture. And how many hits do I get? How many story likes do I hit? It's the Rotten Tomatoes of the movie, right? Am I certified fresh today or not, right? And then that has its own stuff. You know, a good storyteller probably knows in his or her heart that there's a lot of made up, make believe, and half truths in their story, and that's what makes it more interesting and rich. My mother was fond of saying as we were growing up to be aware of not believing our own press releases, right? Because the temptation is to truly believe, oh, all this about myself is true, right? And then I become performative. I become uninteresting, right? Those people become less interesting. We're more interested in folks that are real, that are stumbling, that are trying to figure it out because that's our life. Whether the culture necessarily values that, it monetizes and rewards monetarily often those who are performative and reach the top. And their stories are interesting to us, but I would imagine that their own personal inner life story is not that interesting.
Yeah.
I'm much more interested in the normal person living on my street and what he or she is going through, because that's my life, than I am so-called quote unquote rich or famous out there that are doing their things. I might be drawn into their story in a moment if there's drama, but there's in horror movies, or what they know about a good horror movie is you don't cast a famous person or what's called an A-list actor in most horror movies because people can't relate. If you cast a nobody, it's like, oh my God, that could be me, right? That's the power of that.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that you offered in your guest reflection form was you talked about attention. And I want to touch on that before we close because I think there's so much pull for our attention right now. There is
Mm,
so much going on in this world that is literally strategically designed
mhm,
to call our attention. How do you walk the path of being discerning and intentional about that? Because that's your currency, is the energy
mm,
you devote to things or the focus you give to things. How do you walk that path? We all have our own kind of ways, but
mm,
it's a superpower. And we're talking
mm.
about superheroes and embracing our weird and changing the world. So how do you do it?
Well, personally, I mean, the work I'm doing requires that I tell my own story, that I put out there what I'm doing in order to develop and maintain the type of work that I do. So part of my storytelling is the selling of what I do. It's saying, here's who I am. I hope my story interests you because I do want to do work with you, or I have a service I want to basically sell to you. So it's part of my sales piece to do that. That's part of what's out there. When I step out of the house today, I'm going to dress in a certain way because I'm going to want to have a certain narrative as I go forward. I want people to see me in a certain way. I mean, I'm wearing a blue shirt today because people like blue. And when I walk into a room or a restaurant, I want people to go, oh, there's a friendly blue shirted guy. If I'm going into a meeting where I'm going to want to really be the person that's going to be leading that meeting and maybe get an outcome I want, I might wear a red shirt. I mean, this is human psychology, but I'm intentional about the physical part of the narrative, the story that I'm wanting to put out there. At the same time, and this is a values thing, I'm very conscious of the effect that story has. I'm very conscious of the other person or persons that I'm interacting with. And it's not my value to rip off people or deceive people. Years ago, when I was living in Australia, my brother Steve, who lives there, he and I both are pretty good stage communicators. And we thought, wow, we should start a religion. Two American guys in Australia. We could start a mega church. We could be telling stories. We could be raking in cash, right? Well, we probably could have, right? But that wasn't who we were. And that's not to disparage church or any of that, because there's some good stuff out there. But we saw it as a way of making money. And we went there because part of that's who we are. Hey, how do we make money? But that's not our value, right? We weren't going to use story in that way.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. And then what's my end game in the world? What do I want to offer the world? I mean, the world's given me life. I love the natural beauty of the world. I love the people in my life. I love the experiences that I have. I'm not always happy, but generally I am happy, and I also enjoy being alive. So I want to participate in nurturing that collective experience of what it means to be a human, what it means to be on this planet that's traveling very fast through a mostly empty, dark universe. Um, but of course, without the darkness, we wouldn't see the light.
Yeah. And what I think I hear in that is attention to your aliveness as being present. And really,
Yes.
I think often we can get pulled on timelines, past and future, and there's a special magic that's found, whether it's actual trail magic or the trail magic-ness of being in the present moment with intention, as you described. You're intentional about how you're moving, how you're dressing, how you're making
Mhm.
your choices, but there's also a presence where the moment can then meet you and communicate with you that maybe, and maybe I'm projecting this, but I'm often in awe of how the moment wants to meet me when I finally get present and listen and observe and get out of my own stuff.
Mm.
It's this really cool conversation and relationship between me and life when I slow
Mm.
down enough to meet it and bring my attention and intention to the right space. And I think I'm hearing some of that in what you're saying.
Well, and what I know about you, you do that very well because I've seen you out in the world, right? And listening and connecting and feeling the moment. Um, that's being both, whoever's on stage also needs a good audience.
Mhm.
And we can often be a good audience to other people. That might be part of the trail magic
Mhm.
to where I'm attentive, I'm listening. What does this person want or need from me at the moment? I'm going to laugh because they told a joke. I'm going to applaud when they're done. You know, that's part of the relationship.
Yeah. I mean, if my job could be a front row head nodder and smiler for people, I think I would just lock it in. That.
Well, you're doing that with this podcast, aren't you? I mean, you're inviting people on and having them share their stories, their way of being in the world. So you're honoring us by welcoming us into this that you've created. So it's very special. So thank you for seeing me.
Oh yes, I do, and I appreciate you and just the incredible people that say yes to sharing their time and wisdom in this space. So the last thing I want to ask, because this is, I say it's kind of like casting a magical spell, is what is your imaginal vision for the world at this point? Like
Oh,
what
that's a
would you
great question.
love to just
Yeah.
imagine into reality?
Well, I would love for us all to, first of all, love ourselves. And I believe that most of the sadness and discomfort and destruction in the world is because we don't love who we are and we then project all the wound onto other people. Um, I think that's part of the tragedy of being human. So, what I would envision is if we all embraced ourselves, loved ourselves, and then we're able to love others. And like you said earlier, the weirdness or the strangeness of others, to not be afraid of that, to be honest that it's different, but then to allow space for people to be where they are. And then also that we're able to both support one another, but also hold one another accountable in a way that's healthy. And realize that at the end of the day, we're all very fragile, we're very fleeting, and we're here for a very, very short time.
Yeah.
So live life.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I love that. Okay, I think that's a perfect place to end. But before we officially end, tell the people how they can find you, learn about you. I'll put the links in the show notes, but I think people like to hear it as well.
Sure,
So, how
sure,
can
will
they
do.
tap into your wisdom?
Right. Well, I have three websites because they all have different aspects of who I am. The first is my consulting site, which is corporatecraft.net. Then my creative site, which is davidhuffcreative.com. And then I have a new site I'm developing called wearetrailmagic.com. So those are the three ways to kind of check out a little bit about who I am and what I'm up to.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate you. Thank you for being here and more to come.
Great. It's been a lot of fun. You're a great host of a great podcast. Thanks, Megan.